There's a moment right before you speak the truth in a room that doesn't want to hear it, where everything goes still, your breath slows, your heart starts to pound in your ears. Not because you're afraid of what you're going to say, but because you know that once the words leave your mouth, something will change. Maybe everything. And in that moment, you have a choice. Say what's safe or say what's real. When Denzel Washington walked into that studio, it wasn't with a script in hand or a carefully crafted PR smile. It wasn't about lighting or applause or camera angles. It was about something deeper, something heavy. He had watched, he had listened, and he had come to speak, not as an actor, but as a man who was tired of watching conversations become cages. Most people, when they step onto a talk show set, they know the rules. Smile when they laugh, nod when they speak, say just enough to seem insightful, not so much that anyone gets uncomfortable. But Denzel wasn't there to play by those rules. And deep down, the people watching, they didn't want him to, because people are starving for honesty, for realness, for someone to just say what's been sitting in the back of their minds for years. That's what this moment was about. Not a movie, not a celebrity, but a fracture in the foundation of how we communicate in public life. See, what made this moment so powerful wasn't just what was said. It was how it was said. No shouting, no insults, no performance. Just a calm, relentless honesty that cut through the fog like a spotlight. That's the kind of presence most people will never understand until they witness it. It's not volume that makes a voice powerful. It's clarity. It's intention. It's knowing that what you're saying matters. Not because people agree, but because it's true. Denzel sat there, fully aware that the conversation was already tilting. The questions weren't really questions. They were declarations wrapped in question marks, subtle attempts to pull him into a script he hadn't written. One designed to frame him, not feature him. But instead of reacting with defensiveness or silence, he shifted the entire conversation by asking something simple, yet dangerous. Why? Why should stories be forced into ideological molds? Why are differing perspectives treated like threats instead of opportunities? Why have we confused disagreement with disrespect? And in asking those questions, he broke the illusion. He turned a talk show into a mirror. And suddenly, everyone on that stage had to look at themselves in it. There's a weight that comes with speaking truth in a room full of performance. It's not just about being right. It's about being brave enough to let go of the need to be liked. And that's rare, because in a world built on validation, the scariest thing you can do is not care whether they clap when you finish. But here's the thing. Denzel didn't need applause. His words weren't a performance. They were a reckoning. In the moment he challenged the premise, not the person, but the premise, the walls started to shake. That's the power of presence. It's not about dominance. It's about conviction. It's about stepping into a space and refusing to shrink, no matter who's sitting across from you. You see, confidence isn't arrogance. Arrogance is loud but shallow. Confidence is quiet and unshakable. That's what made his presence so unnerving. Not because he raised his voice, but because he didn't have to. He wasn't trying to win the moment. He was trying to tell the truth. And the truth is, most people don't want conversations. They want compliance. They want affirmation dressed up as dialogue. But Denzel came to offer neither. He came to speak, not to please, not to provoke, but to illuminate, to say out loud what so many are afraid to admit, that somewhere along the way, we stopped listening, not just to others, but to ourselves. And maybe that's why this moment hit so hard, because it reminded people of what's been missing, not just in media, but in our lives, that deep, unshakable need for authenticity, for someone to say without flinching that the emperor has no clothes, that we've built an entire culture on curated conversations and selective truths, and that if we don't stop, we'll lose the very thing that makes us human, our ability to connect through honest disagreement. When he asked why we assume movies must carry a specific political message, he wasn't attacking anyone. He was defending art. He was defending the idea that stories are meant to reveal, not recruit, to awaken, not instruct, and that sometimes the most political thing a film can do is tell the truth about being human. Messy, uncertain, flawed, and full of contradiction. But that kind of honesty is threatening to people who've built their influence on certainty. Because if you admit you might be wrong, even for a moment, the entire illusion starts to crack. And that's exactly what happened in that studio. The illusion cracked. You could see it in the way the host's expression changed, from curiosity to defensiveness to outrage. You could feel it in the silence that followed every answer. Not the silence of agreement, but of realization. A silence that said, "We weren't ready for this. We didn't plan for someone like you." But Denzel didn't come to fit in. He came to reveal. And what he revealed was a sickness, one that's been growing for years in our public conversations. The idea that if someone disagrees with you, they must be your enemy, that their ideas are dangerous, that their presence must be managed, not welcome. That's not discourse. That's control. That's fear pretending to be confidence. And fear hates honesty because honesty doesn't play by the same rules. In that studio, Denzel didn't argue. He exposed. He held up a mirror and asked gently but firmly, "Is this who we are now? Is this the best we can do?" The most powerful part of that moment wasn't the confrontation. It was the composure. It was watching someone refuse to match volume with volume, insult with insult. Instead, he answered anger with clarity. He met accusation with calm. And that's a lesson we all need right now. In a world where outrage is currency, restraint is revolutionary. In a culture addicted to takedowns and clapbacks, someone who simply tells the truth without needing to crush the other person becomes a rare kind of threat, the kind that wakes people up. And maybe that's what this is really about. Not a talk show, not even Denzel, but a wake-up call. A reminder that presence matters, that integrity matters, that we're not as divided as they want us to believe, but we are scared. Scared of being misunderstood, scared of being alone, scared that if we speak, we'll be shamed. So we stay silent, but silence is its own kind of lie. And in that moment, Denzel chose to speak, not just for himself, but for everyone who's been watching, listening, thinking, this doesn't feel right anymore. Everyone who's seen how conversations have become battlegrounds and wondered if we'll ever find our way back to the table. He sat in that chair and reminded us that presence, real, grounded, unapologetic presence, is powerful. That you don't have to yell to be heard. You just have to be clear. You just have to believe what you're saying more than you fear what they'll think. And maybe that's the hardest thing to do today. Not because we don't know what we believe, but because we've been taught that believing deeply and saying it out loud is dangerous. But here's what Denzel showed us. It's not dangerous to speak the truth. What's dangerous is letting fear decide who gets to speak. So if you've been waiting for permission to show up fully, to speak with conviction, to step into a space and not shrink to fit its comfort, this is it. This is your moment. Be the presence that breaks the pattern. Be the voice that doesn't shake, even when the room does. Because that's what changes things. That's what starts the real conversation.
There's something unsettling about watching a conversation where the outcome is already decided before the first question is even asked. You can feel it, can't you? That quiet sense that what you're seeing isn't really a dialogue, but a performance. That the questions aren't meant to invite answers. They're meant to confirm beliefs. And yet we keep watching. We watch the arguments that aren't arguments. We watch the applause that's been pre-cued. We watch the outrage, the mock debates, the smirks that signal who's winning. And we think we're witnessing real communication. But deep down, we know we're not. This is where the story truly begins to unfold, not with confrontation, but with observation. With a man who sat quietly in his home, watching a show he'd soon appear on, and seeing something most people miss. He didn't just see lights and laughter. He saw something darker, something rehearsed, something hollow. He watched guests with diverse opinions be laughed off, interrupted, subtly humiliated, not for being rude or ill-informed, but simply for being different, for saying something outside the bubble. And that bothered him, not as a celebrity, not as a performer, but as a citizen, as a man who understood what it means when a culture stops listening. So he did something radical. He paid attention, not with judgment, with curiosity. He watched not just what was said, but how it was received, the facial expressions, the tone, the timing of interruptions, the way certain ideas were framed before they were even spoken. He noticed which guests were allowed to finish their sentences and which ones were gently but firmly redirected, which ideas were clapped for and which ones were allowed to hang in awkward silence until the show moved on. What he saw wasn't a conversation, it was containment. And if you've ever felt like you have to filter every thought before you speak, you know what that feels like. But here's the deeper truth. The show he was watching wasn't unique. It was just a reflection of something that happens everywhere now, in newsrooms, in classrooms, on social media, even around dinner tables. A slow erosion of curiosity, a quiet replacement of dialogue with performance. We don't watch to learn anymore. We watch to be reassured. We don't listen to understand. We listen for the moment we can speak. We don't enter conversations hoping to grow. We enter hoping to win. And that shift has changed everything. We used to come to the table with questions. Now we come with scripts. We used to say, "Tell me what you think." Now we say, "Let me tell you why you're wrong." The scariest part, most of us don't even realize it's happening because the media we consume shapes the way we think. It's not just about information. It's about rhythm, pattern, emotional response. If we spend enough time watching conversations where people are mocked for their views, we begin to expect that from each other. If we constantly see ideas framed as threats, we stop exploring them. We shrink our minds, one headline at a time, and we start to forget what real conversation feels like. But not Denzel. He remembered. He remembered that dialogue is supposed to stretch us, not validate us. That disagreement isn't disrespect. That the moment we stop allowing people to speak freely, even if we find their ideas uncomfortable, we lose something essential. Not just civility, not just balance. We lose truth, because truth doesn't live in one corner of the room. It lives in the space between us, in the tension, in the listening, in the courage to say, "I don't see it that way, but I want to understand why you do." And somewhere along the way, we forgot that. We began to reward certainty and punish complexity. We elevated sound bites over stories. And the shows we watch, they're not the problem, they're the symptom. The symptom of a culture that's grown so uncomfortable with uncertainty that it tries to edit out anything that doesn't fit neatly into its narrative. But truth doesn't fit neatly. And Denzel saw that. So when he walked into that studio, he wasn't just prepared for an interview. He was prepared for resistance. He knew that his refusal to play along, to smile politely and move on, would be met with confusion, maybe even hostility. But he also knew that silence would cost more than discomfort. It would cost integrity. Because when you see something broken and you have a platform, you don't look away. You speak. You don't have to scream. You don't have to attack. But you do have to speak. And that's what he did. Not just on camera, but in the way he prepared. In the weeks before that moment, he trained, not in lines, but in thought. He studied the show not as a celebrity, but as a citizen. He asked himself what kind of conversation he wanted to be part of, and what kind he refused to perpetuate. That level of intentionality is rare, and it matters, because most of us are just reacting. We're scrolling, swiping, nodding along without even realizing we've stopped thinking for ourselves. We're letting the rhythm of the content dictate the rhythm of our thoughts. And over time, that rhythm becomes reality. We start believing that disagreement is aggression, that complexity is weakness, that anyone who doesn't speak our language must be ignorant, evil, or both. But Denzel interrupted that rhythm. He reminded us what it looks like to pause, to ask better questions, to speak with clarity, even when the room wants confusion, because clarity is contagious. And in that moment, even people who disagreed with him had to pause, not because he shouted louder, but because he spoke deeper. Not because he had better arguments, but because he had better intentions. He wasn't there to win. He was there to wake something up. And you could see it in the eyes of the people on set. A flicker of discomfort, a shift in posture, that subtle realization that they weren't just hosting an actor. They were being hosted by someone who had come to remind them of what real communication feels like. Not controlled, not curated, real. The kind of conversation that doesn't need applause to be powerful. The kind that makes you sit with your thoughts long after the cameras stop rolling. But maybe the most important part of this whole moment wasn't even what happened on the show. It was what it revealed about us. Because how many of us are watching the same way Denzel was watching? How many of us are noticing what's missing? The depth, the nuance, the courage? And how many of us are willing to do something about it? Not just on TV, in our lives, in the way we listen, in the way we respond, in the kind of questions we ask, in the grace we offer to those who answer. Because it's easy to complain about media bias. It's harder to confront our own. It's easy to point fingers at the host. It's harder to ask, when was the last time I really listened? We all play a part, and we all have a choice. To keep consuming content that confirms our biases, or to seek out conversations that challenge them. To keep nodding along, or to pause and ask, what if there's more? To keep living in rhythm with the noise, or to find our own voice. Denzel found his, not just because he's famous, but because he's human, and he chose to bring that humanity into a space that often forgets what that means. That's the lesson. That's the invitation, to remember what conversation can be, to notice what we're being taught subtly daily, and to ask whether it's leading us closer to understanding or just deeper into division. To watch differently, to speak differently, to live differently. Because the moment we start doing that, the rhythm changes. And when the rhythm changes, so does everything else. When you walk into a world that's built for sound bites, you learn to speak in bite-sized pieces. You learn that nuance is liability and complexity is a chore. But sometimes, that world meets someone who talks in paragraphs, in long sentences that don't end with applause. That's when the air crackles. That's when the script is torn up. Denzel Washington didn't just challenge a host, he challenged an entire way of communicating. The kind that starts with assumptions and ends with applause. And that's what episode 3 is about. The anatomy of assumptions and how they shape every conversation we have. Imagine standing at a crossroad. One path is wide, smooth, well-lit, and traveled by millions. The other path is narrow, winding, often overlooked, but it leads deeper into the underbelly of compassion, into places where listening becomes real. Most of us choose the wide path. It's safe, it's clear. It's the one that tells us what to think before we even start walking. That's how most conversations work. Questions come preloaded. They carry an invisible freight, a political slant, a cultural assumption, a should. And by the time we answer, we've already been framed, not just by others, by ourselves. So the moment Denzel sat down and heard the question about why Hollywood shouldn't be more progressive, he didn't just hear the words, he heard the assumption that there's something incomplete, immoral, or irresponsible about storytelling unless it conforms. He leaned back for a moment. He took the shape of the question apart. And instead of playing inside the box that was offered, he asked a different one. Why does the box exist? That's the secret of dismantling assumptions, not by fighting them head on, but by refusing to move in the direction they were pointing, by stepping sideways, by turning the question back on its origin. That simple move forced an entire studio to pause, and in that pause, something started to unravel. Not a debate, and not a breakdown, a transformation, from performance to presence, from surface to substance. And that, right there, is the heart of episode 3. How assumptions operate not only in public discourse, but inside our own heads. When I ask you a question, what am I actually saying? What am I presuming about your values, your identity, your intentions before you speak? That's what happens in social media feeds, in political campaigns, even in family dinner conversations. We're asked to affirm without thinking, to answer before understanding. And if you balk, the response isn't curiosity, it's accusation. Why won't you just agree? We're told that recasting their question is aggressive, but recasting it is actually the beginning of curiosity. Denzel understood that. He didn't attack the host, he attacked the premises. He didn't say, "You're wrong." He said, "Let's talk about the ground we're standing on." And that's what disarmed the politicians, talk show hosts, pundits, and even our own interior selves. Because when someone refuses to play on your field or inside your assumptions, you lose control. And that kind of power isn't supposed to work in polite television studios. It's supposed to work in think tanks, private dinners where everyone's already agreed with each other, or late night echo chambers. But Denzel brought it to daytime TV. He brought intentionality to a space built for superficiality. Let me tell you this, no one escapes assumptions. We all live inside them, shaped by our culture, our upbringing, our news intake, our algorithms. And most of the time, we don't even know they're there because they feel like the obvious way, like gravity, until gravity shifts. That's what happens when someone refuses to build upon the ground you laid. The floor starts to wobble. People glance down. They realize this room isn't as solid as it looked. Here's the conversation you never hear. What did they actually mean by that question? What assumptions are hidden in the tone, the premise, the posture? If we asked it more, we'd find more room for real dialogue. Because the moment you question the question, you're no longer a pawn. You're a person. You're someone who expects more than compliance. You expect engagement. You expect honesty. Which brings us to the point of episode 3. Not to tell you what to think, but to invite you to think differently about questions. When someone asks, "Don't you think X should do Y?" Maybe before answering, you ask, "Why does X need to do Y? Who decided that? What are we not seeing?" That's how assumptions unravel. That's how depth returns. That's how conversations regain relevance. Maybe that's why the host stumbled as Denzel asked her unconstrained questions back. Not because she couldn't handle a conversation, but because the format never prepared her for one. It prepared her for compliance, for chirpy banter disguised as inquiry. But real inquiry doesn't play by script. It asks for risk. It looks for edges. And Denzel walked right to those edges. He didn't necessarily want to break the host. He wanted to break the pattern, to show what a real question can do. So episode 3 is an invitation, not to memorize talking points, not to parrot lines, but to unlearn how to accept questions at face value, to notice when a question is trying to do more than just ask, and to refuse to answer until the question is honest. Because once the question is honest, so is your answer. And that's the first step away from predictable conversation and toward real transformation. Maybe it'll feel uncomfortable. It might be confrontational. Maybe people will accuse you of being difficult. But guess what? They're probably just afraid you're not playing by the same rules anymore. You were supposed to say yes, but you said why. You see, episode 3 isn't just a show. It's a skill, a glimpse into how to break that loop inside us, in the media, at the dinner table. And if we can't question the questions, we'll just keep answering to walls. There's a strange thing that happens when people rise up for the right reasons. They stand for truth. They speak out. They get loud when no one else will. And in doing so, they earn trust. They build a platform. But over time, something quiet and dangerous can creep in. The power they earn to fight injustice slowly becomes the power they use to define it. It doesn't happen all at once. It starts with good intentions, a desire to protect people, to give voice to the unheard, to hold the powerful accountable. But then one day they stop listening, not to their critics, to themselves. What began as a mission becomes a brand. What started as a voice for the people becomes a filter, deciding who counts as the people and who doesn't. And it's subtle. That's what makes it so hard to see, especially for the one holding the mic. That's why this moment hit so hard. When Denzel spoke up, it wasn't because he didn't respect activism. It was because he did. He's seen what courage looks like. He knows what it costs. And he recognized something he couldn't ignore. Someone who once fought for open dialogue, now controlling the conversation like a gatekeeper. It wasn't about disrespect. It wasn't personal. It was a mirror. And the reflection in that mirror wasn't easy to look at, because when someone speaks truth to power, we cheer. But when someone speaks truth to those who used to speak truth, things get awkward. People get defensive. Suddenly the truth is disrespectful or aggressive or out of line. But is it? Or is it just inconvenient? When you become the one with the mic, with the followers, with the power to shape what millions of people hear every day, you have a responsibility. Not just to say what's right, but to ask yourself, am I still fighting for truth or just protecting my position? That's what Denzel was pointing at, not a person, but a pattern. The pattern where righteous people stop making space for disagreement, where the people who used to challenge the system become the system, where conversation turns into compliance. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't roll his eyes. He just asked hard questions, the kind that only someone who cares would ask. And that's what made it powerful, because he could have gone along with it, could have smiled, promoted the film, and walked away, but he didn't. He used the moment. He chose to speak directly, to name what most people dance around, to say, without venom or sarcasm, that silencing disagreement, especially when you once fought against being silenced, isn't strength. It's fear wearing the mask of leadership. And that message didn't land lightly. It challenged not just a person, but a belief system. One that says if you've done good in the past, you're beyond criticism in the present. One that says your story gives you the right to end someone else's. One that confuses moral history with moral immunity. But the truth is this: no one is above accountability. Not even those who built their brand holding others accountable. There's a difference between fighting for what's right and deciding you are what's right. That shift happens slowly, but once it does, every disagreement starts to look like an attack. Every new idea feels like a threat. And suddenly, the platform that was built to lift up others becomes a fortress to protect the ego of its owner. Denzel didn't name that out of malice. He named it because too few people do. And that's what makes these moments rare. When someone with credibility chooses conscience over comfort, because let's be honest, it's easier to keep quiet. It's easier to nod along, to smile, to let it go, especially in front of cameras, especially when you know the backlash is coming. But sometimes the quietest path is the most dangerous one, because silence can sound a lot like agreement. And Denzel wasn't willing to be mistaken for agreeing. So he spoke. He wasn't trying to win. He was trying to warn. Because it's not just about that one moment on that one stage. It's about what happens when we stop checking ourselves, when we get so used to being right that we can't even hear a perspective that doesn't echo our own. It's about how easily power convinces us we're still the underdog, even after we've built empires. About how fast we start confusing passion with permission to dismiss others. About how often we forget that leadership isn't about being followed, it's about being worth following. If that sounds harsh, good. Maybe it should, because the people who most need to hear it are often the ones surrounded by silence. No one wants to be the person who calls out a hero. No one wants to be accused of attacking a legacy. But truth doesn't care about comfort zones. It doesn't bend around reputation. It walks straight through it. And when someone tells you you've changed, that's not always a compliment. Sometimes it's a wake-up call. The most dangerous transformation isn't from bad to worse. It's from brave to blind. Blind to the way your words dominate instead of invite. Blind to the discomfort in the room. Blind to the faces that used to smile with you, now frozen, unsure if they're allowed to disagree. Denzel saw that. And instead of walking past it, he put words to it. Because the moment we stop inviting challenge is the moment we stop growing. You don't have to agree with everything someone says. You don't have to change your mind. But if you can't tolerate the fact that someone else sees it differently, that's not activism. That's absolutism. And the difference matters. So maybe what happened on that stage wasn't a clash. Maybe it was a correction, a necessary moment where someone said, I see you slipping, and I'm not going to let this moment pass without saying something. Because real friends don't just clap. Real allies don't just nod. Real respect isn't afraid to say, you're losing your way. That takes guts, and it takes love, the hard kind, the kind that says, you matter too much to let this slide. We live in a time where performance is praised and truth is punished, but we don't have to keep feeding that cycle. We can choose to listen, to reflect, to open up. And maybe, just maybe, that moment on that stage wasn't an attack. It was a lifeline. The kind of lifeline that says, come back. Come back to the reason you started. Come back to the courage that brought you here. Come back to the version of yourself that made space for others. Not because you're wrong, but because the moment you think you can't be, that's when you are. There's a moment in every conversation when someone leans back just slightly, not because they're relaxed, but because they've been pushed out. It's quiet. You might miss it if you're not watching closely. But it matters, because that small shift often tells the real story. It says, this space isn't for me anymore. We don't talk enough about that, about the invisible rules that govern who gets to speak, about the way some voices are welcomed and others are quietly managed. Not with outright censorship. No, that would be too obvious. It happens with eye rolls, with subtle interruptions, with the way certain ideas are framed as problematic before they're even fully spoken. And when Denzel saw that happening again and again, he didn't just see a pattern. He saw a problem, a culture pretending to be inclusive while slowly narrowing the definition of acceptable thought, a table that claims to welcome everyone, but only sets a place for those who already agree. He wasn't angry. He was awake. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. That's what made his words so disarming. He wasn't yelling. He wasn't trying to dominate the room. He was asking a simple question. When did disagreement become dangerous? Not the kind of disagreement that disrespects, but the kind that simply sees the world through a different lens. The kind of difference that used to make conversations richer, more honest, more human. But somewhere along the way, we traded that kind of dialogue for something safer, at least on the surface. We started rewarding sameness and calling it solidarity. We began pushing away complexity and calling it clarity. And in doing so, we lost something vital. Because when you only listen to the voices that already reflect your values, you stop growing. And worse, you start believing that your values are the only ones that deserve space. That's how people end up being pushed out of the conversation without anyone ever saying the words. And when Denzel called that out, it wasn't just for the sake of being provocative. It was out of concern. He didn't want to dominate the room. He wanted to open it, to stretch it, to remind the people sitting there and watching from home that making room for other voices doesn't weaken your own. It makes it stronger. But that message isn't easy to hear when you've built your voice by speaking for others. When your identity, your platform, your sense of purpose is tied to being the one who gives others a voice. Suddenly, someone pointing out that you've stopped listening doesn't feel like a gentle reminder. It feels like a threat. And that's the tension no one likes to name. That sometimes the people who say they're creating space are actually just rearranging the furniture, moving things around, but still deciding who sits where. Denzel wasn't there to rearrange. He was there to ask why the door had gotten smaller, why some people are allowed to finish their thoughts while others are interrupted mid-sentence, why some ideas are immediately applauded and others are met with silence or sarcasm, why tolerance so often looks like celebration when we agree and quiet hostility when we don't. These aren't easy questions, but they're necessary because the moment we decide who's allowed to speak is the moment we decide who's allowed to be fully human. And that's what was really at stake in that studio. Not just airtime, not just a clash of perspectives, but the deeper question of whether or not we still believe in conversation as a shared act of truth-seeking, or just a performance for whoever already agrees with us. Think about it. How many times have you stopped yourself from saying something, not because it wasn't true, not because it wasn't kind, but because you knew the room couldn't handle it? That's the fear Denzel was speaking into. The fear that if you say the wrong thing, or even the unexpected thing, you'll be cut off, labeled, or quietly removed. That's not progress. That's control with better branding. And here's the heartbreaking part. Most people in those spaces do want to do good. They want justice. They want equity. But they've confused equity with uniformity. And so the people who speak differently aren't seen as contributors. They're seen as threats. But what if the real threat isn't disagreement? What if it's the silence we force on people by making them feel like they don't belong in the conversation? That's what Denzel challenged, not with force, but with presence, with composure, with the kind of clarity that doesn't need to raise its voice because it knows the truth speaks loud enough. He didn't demand the mic. He waited until it was handed to him. And then he used it, not for self-promotion, but for an invitation to remember what conversation is supposed to be. Not a battlefield, not a purity test, not a spotlight, a table, a place where people show up with different stories, different beliefs, different wounds, and still decide to sit down, look each other in the eye and say, tell me how you see it. And if that sounds too idealistic, maybe we've just forgotten what's possible. Because every time we reward sameness over substance, we lose a little more of what makes us human. We become safer, maybe, but smaller. And eventually we end up in rooms where everyone agrees and no one's really learning. That's the quiet tragedy of modern discourse. Not the yelling matches, but the shrinking tables. The unspoken rules that say, you can be here, but only if you sound like us. Denzel didn't sound like everyone else in that room. And thank God he didn't. Because his voice reminded us of what we've lost and what we can still reclaim. Not by shouting louder, but by making space. By being brave enough to let other voices speak, even when we don't understand them right away. Especially then. Because understanding doesn't start with agreement. It starts with listening. And listening requires letting go of the need to control the conversation. That's not weakness. That's maturity. And that's how we grow. There's a line that gets crossed in almost every argument. You know the one. The moment it stops being about the idea and starts being about the person. When the tone shifts, the words tighten, and suddenly it's not about what you said, it's about who you are. That's the moment the conversation dies. And in its place, something colder takes root. A contest, a performance, a takedown. Denzel Washington didn't come to compete. He didn't come to win a debate. He came to offer a point of view. But when that point of view didn't align with the expected rhythm of the show, something subtle started to happen. The conversation stopped being about the movie or even the message. It started becoming about him. It began with tone, a slight edge in the voice. Then came the passive-aggressive pivot, the kind of comment that makes the audience laugh but isn't really a joke. And finally, when the ideas couldn't be dismissed, the person had to be. That's when the host looked him in the eye and told him maybe he should stick to acting. It was meant to sting, and it did, not because it was true, but because of what it implied, that if you're not the right kind of thinker, your thoughts don't matter, that if your expertise comes from one field, you have no right to speak into another, that your value ends where someone else's comfort begins. That's not just disrespect, that's erasure, the quiet kind. But what happened next was the real story. Denzel didn't rise to meet the insult. He didn't fire back. He didn't even raise his voice. He just held his ground, with clarity, with dignity, with a presence that said, you don't get to decide the limits of my voice. Because that's what real strength looks like. Not clapping back, not going viral, not snapping with the perfect one-liner. Real strength is restraint. It's what happens when you choose truth over ego. When you let your presence speak louder than your pride. And the power of that moment wasn't just in what he said, it was in what he refused to do. He refused to make it personal. He stayed rooted in the issue, in the message, in the conversation that still needed to happen, even if the host didn't want to have it anymore. There's a lesson in that, one we all need. Because let's be honest, we live in a time where personal attacks have become normal. Where disagreement isn't just disagreement, it's character assassination. Where we don't challenge ideas, we cancel people. And every time we do, we lose something. We lose the chance to hear each other out. We lose the space between positions, the space where growth actually happens. We lose our ability to distinguish between someone being wrong and someone being worthless. That's the danger. Because once you make it personal, you no longer have to respond to the argument. You just respond to the person. You label them, dismiss them, disqualify them, and move on. No growth, no challenge, just the illusion of victory. But Denzel wouldn't let that happen. He didn't come to win. He came to witness, to stand in truth and invite others to meet him there. And when the conversation turned toward character, he turned it right back toward principle. He reminded the room that complexity isn't an insult, that asking hard questions doesn't make you arrogant, that standing your ground isn't disrespect, It's responsibility. Because if you don't hold your voice when it's under attack, it's not really your voice. It's a borrowed one, shaped by fear and approval. That's what makes moments like this so rare. They're not just about courage. They're about composure. And in a culture where people measure power by how loud they can be, he measured his by how calm he could stay. That matters, because it's easy to shout, easy to clap back, easy to make a scene. What's hard is to stay steady when the ground shifts beneath you, to keep speaking truth even when the room gets cold, to honor the conversation even when someone tries to make it about your resume instead of your reason. We've seen too many arguments spiral, too many people fall into the trap of insult for insult. It feels good in the moment, but it solves nothing. It doesn't move the needle. It doesn't change hearts. It just feeds the noise. But when someone resists that pull, when they choose stillness instead of outrage, that's what leaves an impact. That's what people remember. And that's what Denzel did. He reminded everyone that you don't have to justify your place at the table. You just have to speak when it's time. And when someone tries to shrink you down to fit their comfort, you don't shrink. You stay grounded. You look them in the eye and you keep speaking. Not to win, not to wound, but to witness to the truth, to the moment, to the fact that being calm is not the same as being silent. There's a power in that, the kind of power that doesn't need applause, the kind that doesn't flinch when it's misunderstood, the kind that's building something deeper than a moment. It's building a legacy. Because anyone can trade insults, but not everyone can trade silence for wisdom. Not everyone can stand in the middle of a room that's trying to turn them into a caricature and refuse to become it. That's the power of self-possession. The power of staying rooted when someone tries to uproot you with their assumptions. The power of remembering that your story, your mind, your dignity is not up for negotiation just because someone else feels threatened. That's not arrogance. That's clarity. And in times like these, clarity is rare. So the next time someone tries to make it personal, pause, breathe, don't react, respond, speak from principle, not from pain. And when the moment tempts you to clap back, ask yourself, is this about me or about the truth I came here to share? Because when you remember that, no insult can move you. You're anchored, and anchored people don't drift. Respect isn't something you can demand. Not really. You can ask for it. You can chase it. But the kind of respect that lasts, the kind that walks into a room before you do, that has to be earned over time, through action, through consistency, through showing up when it's hard and still doing the right thing. That's the kind of respect Denzel Washington carried into that studio, not the kind you wave around, the kind you wear without even trying. And you could feel it, the way the room shifted when he spoke. Not because he was louder, but because he was rooted. Because every word came from a place deeper than approval, deeper than ego. He didn't flash credentials. He didn't name drop or list achievements. He didn't need to. That's the difference between earned authority and assumed power. Assumed power is loud. It's defensive. It's constantly reminding you who's in charge. Earned authority? It doesn't need to remind anyone. It shows itself in presence, in the way people lean in when you talk, not because they're told to, but because they want to hear what you'll say next. That's the tension that unfolded in that conversation. One person sitting in the comfort of their usual seat, backed by years of experience, but growing more reactive by the second. The other, a guest, a so-called outsider, calm, measured, unshaken. Not trying to own the space, just unwilling to surrender his voice in it. And when the host turned the conversation toward personal history, accusing him of being privileged, suggesting he had every door opened for him, that wasn't just an insult. It was an attempt to erase the work that got him there, to rewrite his story in real time. But Denzel didn't take the bait. He didn't respond with anger. He responded with facts, with history, with the long road he's walked, through roles that weren't always flattering, through studios that didn't always see his value, through decades of proving again and again that his talent wasn't an accident. It was earned. He reminded her and everyone watching that his success wasn't handed to him. It was built, slowly, brick by brick, rehearsal by rehearsal, failure by failure. He didn't inherit the spotlight. He fought for it, protected it, respected it. And yet, even in that moment when he had every right to defend himself with fire, he chose dignity. Not because he had to, but because he could. That's what earned authority gives you. The power to stay kind, even when kindness isn't returned. The power to rise above the noise without needing to stand on anyone else's shoulders. That kind of authority doesn't just command respect. It reveals when someone else is relying on something weaker. Because when you truly have experience, you don't need to dominate. You listen. You ask better questions. You speak with care because you know the weight your voice carries. Assumed power can't do that. It's too busy protecting its image, too afraid of looking small. So it gets loud. It interrupts, it belittles. And when someone like Denzel walks in, someone who doesn't flinch, doesn't beg, doesn't play along, that power starts to crack because it realizes it can't compete on depth. It can only distract. And that's what made the moment so uncomfortable. It exposed a dynamic that's everywhere now. Politics, in entertainment, in everyday life. People with platforms forgetting how they got them. People mistaking their spotlight for wisdom. People who once fought for access, now guarding the gate like it belongs to them. But access isn't ownership. And the microphone doesn't make you right. It just makes you louder. That's why what Denzel did matters. He didn't try to take the mic. He didn't try to overshadow anyone. He simply used his moment to remind us all what real credibility looks like. It's quiet. It's thoughtful. It's unshaken by petty attacks. And it refuses to let someone rewrite a life that was lived in full. Because we all know what it feels like to be told our experience doesn't count, to be talked over, dismissed, reduced. And if you're not careful, you start to believe it. You start to wonder if your story really matters. But it does. And not because someone else validates it, because you lived it, because you earned it. That's the power Denzel carried. Not just in his words, but in how he didn't let someone else's insecurity define him. He held the line, not to win a debate, but to remind everyone watching, your value doesn't depend on anyone's permission. And in a culture obsessed with applause and visibility, that kind of inner confidence is revolutionary. It reminds us that not all influence looks like popularity. Some of it looks like character. Not all leadership stands at a podium. Some of it stands quietly in the back, refusing to compromise truth. And not all power needs permission. Some of it was forged in silence, in struggle, in the long, invisible work of becoming someone who doesn't need to prove anything anymore. That's what we saw in him. And maybe that's why the confrontation felt so revealing, because it wasn't about two people arguing. It was about what happens when assumed power meets earned presence and realizes it can't win with noise. It can only listen if it's brave enough. Sometimes it's not what's said that changes everything. It's the silence, the breath held too long, the eyes darting across the room, the weight of what no one's willing to say. There was a moment in that studio when the words stopped and the silence started speaking louder than anyone on stage. The camera was rolling, the lights were bright, but it was the people not speaking who told the real story. The crew paused, the host looked around, the audience shifted in their seats. No one said a word. And yet, that silence held more truth than any of the questions or answers, because silence doesn't mean nothing is happening. Sometimes silence is the loudest response you can get. It means people are feeling something they don't yet know how to express. It means the surface has cracked. That's the kind of moment most people try to skip over. Cut to commercial. Tell a joke. Change the subject. But Denzel didn't let that happen. He stayed in it. He stayed with the tension, with the discomfort. And in doing so, he forced everyone else to feel it too. Not because he was trying to provoke, because he was trying to wake something up. See, we talk a lot about the people with the microphone, the ones speaking, arguing, taking a stand. But we forget about the people in the room who say nothing, who nod politely, who smile because it's easier than disagreeing. But they shape the moment too. Silence isn't neutral. It's a choice. And that choice can either create space for truth or protect the status quo. Everyone watching that interview, whether in the studio or at home, had a part to play. They could have clapped, spoken up, questioned the tone, but they didn't. They just watched, like so many of us do every day as voices get drowned out and the same scripts get repeated. We tell ourselves it's not our place. We say we don't want conflict. We convince ourselves that staying quiet is the mature thing to do. But sometimes silence isn't mature. It's convenient. Because when you stay quiet while someone is being misrepresented, interrupted, or diminished, you're not just observing, you're agreeing with your stillness. That's the uncomfortable truth about these moments. They're not just about the people speaking, they're about the room, about the energy that either says this is okay or this is not who we want to be. And the energy in that room, it was nervous, anxious, heavy. People were realizing that something real was happening, something unscripted, and no one knew what to do with it. Because they've been trained, just like we all have, to respond to performances, not presence. They expected promotion, not provocation. They expected politeness, not truth. And when they got truth, unfiltered, composed, grounded, because truth doesn't always make you clap. Sometimes it makes you sit very, very still. But Denzel didn't need their applause. He didn't need the room to be comfortable. He needed the conversation to be honest. He needed the moment to mean something. And so he kept going, even when no one backed him up, even when the co-hosts avoided eye contact, even when the laughter turned into awkward silence. That's what courage looks like. Not defiance, not ego, just not leaving the moment when it gets too real for everyone else. Because the truth is, most people aren't stopped by opposition. They're stopped by isolation, by that feeling of being alone in a room full of people who'd rather not deal with what you just said. But he didn't let that stop him. He stayed grounded. And in doing so, he showed that strength doesn't always need allies. Sometimes it just needs roots. And that, more than the confrontation itself, is what people will remember. Not just what was said, but what wasn't. The silence of the audience, the stillness of the hosts, the way truth filled the space they were too afraid to enter. That's the real conversation. And it's not just about that day. It's about every day, every moment when something needs to be said. And we look around the room hoping someone else will say it. Every time someone's voice is pushed to the edge and the rest of us pretend not to notice. Every time we value harmony more than honesty. But what if the silence is the problem? What if the silence is the lie? Because every system that protects power needs silence to survive. It needs people to look down, to stay seated, to tell themselves this isn't my moment. But maybe it is. Maybe every silence is a signal, a call for someone to break it. Not with noise, not with rage, but with a presence that refuses to disappear. That's what Denzel did. And not just for himself, for every person who's ever been told, be quiet, stay in your lane, you don't belong in this conversation. He showed us that belonging isn't something you wait for. It's something you claim by showing up fully. Even if the room doesn't clap, even if no one says thank you, even if the silence feels like a wall. Because here's the truth. Walls don't move until someone presses against them. And sometimes the only way to make space is to speak into the silence. Even if your voice shakes, even if your knees do too, even if no one joins you at first, because someone always has to go first. Someone always has to break the pattern. And when they do, when they show that the room doesn't define their worth, other people start to remember their own voice too. That's the beginning of change, not a speech, not a soundbite, but a single person choosing to stay in the tension, to name what others are afraid to admit, to listen when the room goes silent and still speak anyway. There's a certain kind of silence that doesn't come from being afraid. It comes from knowing exactly who you are. That's the kind of silence Denzel carried. The kind that doesn't ask for attention but holds it. The kind that doesn't flinch, even when every word being thrown your way is meant to shake you. It's easy to confuse that with weakness, to think that calmness means passivity, that if you don't raise your voice, you must not care. But that couldn't be further from the truth, because the people who stay calm when everything's pushing them to explode, they're not disconnected. They're not detached. They're choosing discipline over reaction. They're making a choice in real time, not to let someone else's chaos become their own. And that's what we saw when Denzel was accused, dismissed, provoked, and finally personally attacked. He didn't snap. He didn't fold. He didn't try to overpower the moment with volume. He just stayed still. Stillness, not silence. There's a difference. Silence is sometimes surrender. Stillness is strategy. Stillness is when you hear the insult, you feel the weight of it, but you refuse to let it distort your voice. Stillness is when you know the moment is too important to be reduced to a reaction. It's not that he wasn't angry. Of course he was. He's human. It's that he didn't let the anger write the next sentence. Because when you've worked your whole life to build something real, respect, integrity, trust, you don't throw it away just because someone wants to see you lose control. You hold the line, not for them, for you. That's power, not the kind that forces people to listen, the kind that makes people want to. Because there's something magnetic about emotional control, not the fake kind where you pretend you're fine while bottling everything up. The real kind, when you know you have every right to unleash, but you choose not to. Because you understand that not every fire is worth lighting. And some rooms are already full of smoke. That's what makes restraint so revolutionary right now. We live in a culture that rewards the clapback, the viral moment, the explosion. We cheer when people lose it on camera. We love the chaos. But chaos doesn't build anything. It just burns through whatever was standing. And what Denzel did was different. He built something in that moment. He showed people what it looks like to protect your peace, not by walking away, but by staying grounded. Because walking away is easy. Anyone can leave when it gets hard. What's harder is staying present, without letting the storm outside become a storm inside. That takes years of work, not just as a public figure, as a person. You don't learn that kind of self-control on set. You learn it in the quiet, when no one's watching, when life is testing you, when you want to react and no one would blame you if you did, but you don't. You pause, you breathe, you respond. That's what he did. In doing so, he gave everyone watching something more powerful than a mic drop. He gave them a model for how to stay composed in a culture that's constantly trying to pull you off center. A model for how to carry your principles into the moments that matter most, when your back's against the wall, when the pressure is real, when the cameras are rolling and the stakes are high. That's when your real values show up, not when it's easy, when it's necessary, because anyone can be composed when they're comfortable, but the ones who can stay composed when they're under attack, those are the people who change the tone of the whole room. That's what happened. He changed the tone. He showed that you don't have to fight fire with fire. Sometimes you fight fire with clarity, with presence, with a deep breath and a well-chosen sentence. That doesn't mean you let people walk over you. It means you know exactly when to stand and how. And maybe that's what more of us need. Not more rage, more clarity, not more volume, more values, not more people shouting for attention, more people willing to speak with intention. Because when you speak from that place, from composure, from clarity, people listen differently. They lean in, not just because of what you're saying, but because of how you're saying it. It feels different. It feels real. And that's what cuts through the noise. Not performance, not perfection, presence. The kind of presence that says, I've been through enough to know who I am, and nothing you say is going to shake that. That's the moment when emotional control becomes emotional leadership. When the way you carry yourself becomes a lesson for everyone watching. Because the truth is, we don't need more spectacle. We need more stillness. We need people who know how to hold space when the room gets loud. People who know how to listen deeply, speak carefully, act with purpose. And none of that shows up unless you train it. Not in a gym, in your everyday life. When someone cuts you off and you don't retaliate. When someone questions your worth and you respond with dignity. When someone doubts your voice and you still speak anyway. That's the practice. That's the power. And that's what Denzel reminded us of, not by being the loudest, by being the most centered. Because at the end of the day, people don't remember every word you say. They remember how you made them feel. And the way he carried himself in that moment, it didn't just make people feel impressed. It made them feel something deeper. It made them feel possible. Like maybe they could do that too. Like maybe they could stop letting the world dictate their tone. Like maybe they could stop matching energy and start setting it. And that's where everything starts to shift. Some conversations don't end with a winner. They end with a mirror. That's what this moment was about. Not victory, not vindication, but reflection. Not just for the people on stage, for us. For anyone who's ever asked themselves, how did we get here? To a place where people talk more than they listen, defend more than they explore, and argue more than they understand. What made this encounter different wasn't just the tension. It was what that tension revealed. It showed us that most conversations aren't really conversations anymore. They're rehearsals. People enter the room with conclusions, not curiosity. They don't come to engage, they come to perform. And when someone disrupts that rhythm, everything shakes. That's what Denzel did. He disrupted the rhythm. He didn't play the role. He didn't follow the cue. He didn't nod and smile and wrap up with a soundbite. He brought something rare into the room, a desire to talk like people used to, with respect, with depth, with a willingness to be uncomfortable in service of something bigger than ego. And that's what the moment demanded: humility. But humility's hard to hold on to when you've built a platform on being the one who's always right. That's where the conversation broke down. Not because someone disagreed, but because someone refused to be questioned. When Denzel asked about responsibility, when he asked whether the host had ever apologized, ever admitted a mistake, ever held herself to the same standard she demanded of others, that was the turning point. Because accountability is easy to preach and hard to practice. It sounds good in theory, but in reality, it means letting go of control. It means saying, I could be wrong. It means risking your own certainty. And for someone used to leading the conversation, that's terrifying. But here's the truth. If you can't be questioned, you're not leading, you're ruling. And that's the difference Denzel made visible. He wasn't attacking the person. He was naming the pattern of people who say they believe in open dialogue, but only so long as they're the ones doing most of the talking. He wasn't trying to flip the power. He was trying to share it. And that's the essence of real dialogue, not just taking turns talking, but making space, holding tension, sticking around long enough to hear something that challenges your beliefs and still choosing to respond with integrity. That kind of space is rare, but we crave it. Deep down, we all do, because it's only in that kind of space that we can change, not just others, ourselves. And that's what this entire series of moments has been about. Not an actor pushing back, not a host defending herself, but a room, a culture, a country asking, what have we lost? What did we lose when we stopped listening? What did we lose when we turned disagreement into disrespect? What did we lose when we decided we didn't have time for hard questions anymore? The answer? We lost trust. We lost curiosity. We lost the very thing that made dialogue worth having in the first place, the belief that the other person might be saying something we need to hear. And the moment we lose that, we stop growing. We stop connecting. We stop learning. But we can find it again. That's what Denzel reminded us. Not by preaching, not by winning, by being willing. Willing to be the only calm voice in a loud room. Willing to ask questions without demanding answers. Willing to stay when everyone else wanted to move on. Because that's what conversation requires. It requires patience. It requires the courage to be misunderstood. It requires the grace to sit across from someone who sees the world differently and still look them in the eye and say, I'm listening. Not I agree. Just, I'm listening. And maybe that's where we begin again. Not with big answers, but with better questions. Not with louder voices, but with deeper ones. Not with trying to be right, but with trying to be real. Because real conversations are messy. They don't follow scripts. They go places you didn't expect, and they leave you changed. Sometimes shaken, sometimes inspired, but always changed. And maybe that's the point. Not to win the argument, but to come away seeing a little more clearly. So if you've stayed with this story through the tension, the silence, the challenge, thank you. Because this wasn't just about a guest and a host. It was about all of us. It was about what kind of people we want to be, what kind of conversations we're willing to have, and what kind of world we want to live in. One where people are shut down, or one where people are invited to speak and to listen and to grow. The choice is ours, and every conversation is a chance to make it.